Hello, I'm Kurt Lidke, Executive Director of Klamath Film, and you just watched Guardians of the River, a fascinating look at the Klamath River Basin and the changes pending as seen from the indigenous perspective with the upcoming dam removals and also food sovereignty. With us is the film's director, Shane Anderson. Shane, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Great to be here again this year.
Yeah, welcome back. You are no stranger to the Klamath Independent Film Festival. You had a film in last year's fest as well, also an environmental outdoor documentary film. I suppose this is your niche, is getting out into the wilderness and capturing it on camera, right?
Absolutely. I kind of formed a niche about 10 years ago in documentaries that focus on environmental issues here in the Pacific Northwest and socioeconomic issues as well.
So what was it about this particular ongoing water and environmental issue on the Klamath River and the Greater Klamath Basin that made you want to make a film about it?
So a few years ago, I started production on a what's going to end up being a 6 or 7 year documentary about the Klamath Dam removals. So I'm really taking a deep dive into the whole basin over a really long period of time. And through that time period, every year I'm going to be releasing at least a short film, if not several short films, as I'm digging into these stories. And last year, Guardians of the River happened to be our first kind of debut short film in this long odyssey of the what we're going to dub the Klamath Chronicles. So it kind of the story kind of came to us. I didn't really know much about food sovereignty, and I've always known the importance of salmon to the rivers of the West and to indigenous communities and to fishermen, but I really had no idea like how important salmon was as a food, as food sovereignty, in some of these rural places where there are literally no grocery stores for hours, and how dependent communities have been for millennia and still are dependent on these resources.
Well, this film is without a doubt in this year's festival the most poignant for our local populace. This is an issue that is not well known necessarily statewide, but in Klamath, this is a huge ongoing discussion between Klamath tribes and the downriver tribes that you profile in this film. And we, of course, have a huge ag base that uses a great amount of water. So there's always this push-pull, especially right now when we have a massive drought ongoing. And so there's not enough water to go around. So this is still very much a fluid, ongoing situation, and one that may change drastically soon, as 4 dams in the Klamath Basin are now scheduled for removal, as it's talked about in this film. But since this is an ongoing thing, it sounds like this is going to be an ongoing coverage on your part as well. Are you closely following the situation, and what kind of follow-ups? Is it going to be a year-by-year update with this, ultimately leading to the massive project, or are you splitting it all into different parts?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to plan years in advance because things are so ever changing down in that basin, especially with the climate impacts. And this year we approached our filming to just be fairly fluid because we didn't know what was going to happen week to week. So we covered the salmon disease die-off in the lower basin this year, and hoping to cover some of the ag perspective as well before the year's over. It's when at the end of the day there was no winners this year. Everybody lost, and at the end of the day, it's really all comes down to food sovereignty. Whether you're a farmer in the upper basin, you're fighting for food, and whether you're an indigenous community in the lower basin, you're fighting for food resources as well. So it's a really tough. It was a really tough year for everybody. Watching 98% of the juvenile salmon die this year that were the cohorts that were going to come back after dam removal was absolutely heartbreaking. Just as I know that farmers with dried up fields, they're feeling the pain too. So yeah, we just got to come up with a way to plan, for these situations. And at some point, you just got to stop calling it a drought if it's happening every single year, and just accept the new normal. And how are we going to, work with these conditions and plan for these conditions in the future?
It is always interesting how if you make a film about something, everyone assumes that you are the resident local expert on it. You do have to do a lot of research, and you're talking to the people involved, so you do learn a lot on the matter. But sometimes I talk to filmmakers, they make a film about it, and everyone expects that suddenly they're like the expert of every last nuance of that. You took on a very a very important topic, but a very tense topic here in the Klamath Basin itself. One that has a lot of dialogue, but what I think is really refreshing about your this particular film, and hopefully with your future ones as well, is looking at the different perspectives of it, because we have a lot of yelling and not a lot of communicating that goes on between tribal water rights and the ag community and water users and downriver and politicians getting involved with whether or not to remove the dams. There's a lot of emotion involved in this, but from the outside perspective, since you are not a local resident in the Klamath Basin, I think people would be interested to hear your perspective on where things currently stand and kind of what's being done to address it, whether you think things are moving in the right direction or if it's just simply too complex for one person to comprehend at this point.
I think things are moving in the best direction they possibly can at this point. And I'm coming to this whole chronicle story looking, as the dam removal is kind of the setback of my, or the backdrop of my story. That's what I came to document. That's the story of how that happened and the story of like what happens afterwards. And I think that there were some really inspirational moments through that process where lower basin people with their indigenous communities with different values than upriver farmers all came together, ate salmon and potatoes together, and hashed out some agreements and started that communication dialogue. And that's just something we don't see in other places around the West. So I do think that there is the opportunity to work together through these tough situations. And I think that, things could have got a lot worse this year. And I feel like, as far as like chaos goes up in the upper basin, if the certain events would have unfolded that haven't so far. And and I applaud the community for not going down the route
it seemed like we could have had history repeating itself of what happened 20 years ago with the whole bucket brigade incident of 2001 that put this area, for better or for worse, on the map as far as a national news conversation. I think a lot of people were expecting that, but if nothing else, whatever protests have gone on, at least to date, and we are recording this in August, so who knows by the time the film festival happens, by to date, I guess the best way to describe them would be half-assed. As far as the protests so far, I think a lot of people are just really tired at this point, just hoping it'll rain, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there's just not enough water to go around, and it's a weather crisis. So hopefully it'll rain. But like there has to be some planning and communicating for if this is a regular, the new normal. And I do think the Klamath Basin can figure this out because they've proven in the past that these different groups have been able to get together and work through a lot of these really complex issues that really are archetype of issues across the entire West right now that everybody's going to have to figure out.
It's very indicative, and one place that you can explore that might be really interesting is looking at more of the history. This film does delve into some of that history as far as fishing rights and trying to fish and police coming in and trying to break up the nets and whatnot, but this is largely more systemic of the Army Corps of Engineers a century ago coming through and basically plowing out an entire floodplain and straightening the rivers, putting dams on them, and draining Tule Lake. You go down by Tule Lake, there's no lake in Tule Lake anymore. It's a bit of a misnomer. There's a lot of environmental destruction that now today we seem to be paying the price for, of hubris of a century ago, thinking that we can just completely modify everything to our absolute will, and we're now kind of paying the price for it, right?
Yeah, I think the more we can kind of look at the needs of nature and how to work within those needs, the more sustainable our communities will be moving forward. For example, the effects of the dam, those don't provide. It's like a lot of people think that those dams provide water for agriculture, and they just don't. And the reason that they need to flush all this extra water down is because there's these fish diseases. So hopefully when the dams are removed, the fish disease will come under, more control. There'll be more cold water spring inputs. The algae problems will go down. and there will be a less need for that extra water to flush down to clean the river because it'll just be naturally doing itself. So the more we can work with ecosystems and natural processes to kind of solve some of these problems, maybe the more water will be available up in the upper basin as well. And just, really looking at it through an ecological lens. When all the infrastructure was built, it was just a very much a manifest destiny ideology that tamed and conquered the West. And now we're learning that, not just in the Klamath Basin, but, you look down at pictures of behind the Hoover Dam right now, and they're having a water crisis. You look at pictures of the, upper Lake Shasta and the Sacramento or Lake Orville, they're drained. It's the first time in history they're not producing power in Lake Orville, I think. So these are things that are happening all over the place, and we really need to kind of start working on ecologic solutions as well.
This film is visually stunning, but it's also very informative. How did you get connected with these particular tribal members to tell their specific stories within the greater context of the water issues?
Yeah, so I'd reached out at first with Sammy Gensaw, who's kind of the main character that runs the Ancestral Guard, which is the group of young folks that are building the garden and catching the salmon and distributing it through their community. And we got together several months before we filmed and kind of talked through some different ideas. And he had told me that they were going to build a garden for the first time. And at first I was kind of going into this to tell more of a dam removal story. And it just really evolved into a food sovereignty story. I just found it such a great connection to, the removal of dams and the return of salmon and why salmon are important, not just from an ecological standpoint, but really a community standpoint down there. And so we were really flexible going into the shoot. Like I had no plans on shooting the garden scene or the food delivery scene. And that just kind of unfolded, as it happens when you're making a verite documentary like that, where it can okay, let's go film this next. And it just all worked out really great.
It provides a nice positive spin on it, because otherwise this could be a very depressing film and a very depressing story, where, as you said a couple minutes ago, there really are no winners involved. But it's showing that there are local community solutions, there are regional solutions, there are statewide solutions, and there are national solutions if we start actually looking at how to do things. And so I was very impressed with the way that you incorporated that into a story about salmon and water rights, to then look at how they're actually looking at ways to adapt locally. And maybe that is the solution, to start local and start building out from there, finding solutions instead of just opining about what we no longer have.
I think the whole solution going into any of these communities in the entire Klamath Basin are local solutions. I mean, there's one common thread that everybody agrees on, and that's government, get out of my life, whether you're in the headwaters or the ocean. So, I don't think looking toward, the government to come save the day is ever going to happen. So I think it's really, really important that solutions are forged locally, and that communication through those communities continues.
Well, I'm not sure if you got lucky or not with the production of this in terms of filming before all hell broke loose in a global pandemic. But how did COVID, if anything, complicate the film production?
Well, it definitely delayed the production, and we did film in the middle of the pandemic. So, and filming with indigenous communities, the reservations were closed off down there. So we had to be extra careful. And just, I get tested like every week, and my crew. So we really just kind of knocked this project out pretty quick too. I think we shot the bulk of it in 4 days, and then I went back to do some pickups. And so, being lucky with the storyline, and being lucky with timing some of the natural events, like the fish, the day we were doing the fishing scene, we just happened to have a pretty good run of fish that day coming in. So we were actually able to film catching fish, and then right afterwards it cut off. And so if we were a day late, we would have missed that whole scene. So, and that only would happen once a year, where we would have that opportunity. So
Right.
yeah, COVID was a challenge, you know, and but we were able to pull it off, and just was extra careful.
Well, the film came together really well. I know how hard it is just to make a film in general, much less trying to do it with all sorts of added restrictions during a global pandemic. So I sincerely applaud any filmmaker who tried to figure out a way to still be creative over the past year and a half. Of course, we had no idea at the time that it would be a year and a half later that we're still talking about this. Ultimately, what do you hope that people take away from watching Guardians of the River? Because we certainly hope that people from the various sides of the conversation get a chance to watch this during our festival, and perhaps can spark a dialogue, whatever that may be, coming out of it. Because it's definitely poignant to our region.
Yeah, I just think relating the health of the river and the return of salmon to the health of people, actually, too. You know, I think a lot of times there's a disconnect between that, and I just hope that this story can highlight the importance of that. You know, because it's always a talk about food and crops and fish, but you know, that's kind of what ties us all together too, as humans, is food, and this is a food story and a health story. You know, bringing back a healthy Klamath River is going to be good for everybody, and really excited to see how dam removal plays out. I hope it stays on schedule, and I hope that not all the baby salmon died this year with the sea Shasta disease. But I'll be editing a little short film for next year about it.
So, where have you been able to show this film, and what have some of the reactions been that you've heard?
Yeah, so we won the Earth X Impact Award down in Austin, Texas, or in Dallas, Texas this year. So that was pretty cool. And it's, you know, just as it kind of opened my eyes up to the whole food sovereignty topic, it's been opening up other people's eyes as well. So I was really happy to see people make that connection, and happy that we were able to show that connection.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Shane, for this film and for joining us. Guardians of the River will be screened on Sunday, September 19th at 12:15 p.m. in our Southern Shorts category, and available all week on demand. Congratulations for making this extraordinary film, and we look forward to the next one.
Thanks a lot, Kurt, and thanks everybody to checking it out. And there'll be more films on the way over the next few years.